Hi everyone, this is Courtney with Texas Teacher Today with free tutoring for core subjects math. So there's lots of options out there when you're studying for the core subjects EC through 6. But I think what sets mine apart is I closely align everything to the competencies and descriptive statements, and I base it specifically on the Texas exam. I don't make material for other states. So everything I do is real similar to the real test. And you know that because you can compare my stuff to the state NESINC manual and see that they're very similar, right? So in free tutoring, I spend about 20 minutes going over stuff and take questions. So this will be quick. But if you want paid tutoring with me, I spend a whole hour going into more detail. So tonight will be quick and but very informative. So we'll go over competency 1 for math, which is actually not math. So it's good news if you don't like math, right? It's all about teaching math, instruction, and assessment. So competency 1 is the teacher knows how students learn mathematical skills and uses that knowledge to design, organize, and implement instruction and assess students' learning, right? So it's not really math in competency 1. You can see the other competencies are math, number operations and concepts, patterns in algebra, geometry and measurement, probability and statistics, and mathematical processes, right? But competency 1, anybody can get better at this, even if math isn't our strong suit, right? So we want to talk about research-based theories and principles of learning mathematics. So what are the research-based ways we can help students learn math? And one thing that works for all subjects is having effective classroom management, because if you don't have control of the classroom, there will be no learning, right? You might know all the math in the world, but you can't communicate that to students if there's chaos. We also want to use collaborative learning activities, right? Lev Vygotsky tells us how important that is. And his name comes up on the PPR also, so that's really important to know. So activities where they're working together. Motivation. If they're motivated, they're going to learn faster and perform better. So some students have intrinsic motivation. They're just naturally motivated. Some need a reward to get them started, right? So that's extrinsic motivation. We can use both. We can appeal to both. Effective teaching strategies. It should always be learner-centered, focused on the students. We should always differentiate instruction. That means we cater it to different learning styles, different readiness levels, abilities, interests, backgrounds, things like that, taking into account each student's individual needs. It's more work for the teacher, but it's worth it, right? Learning styles. We know there are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners, and we want to plan activities for each type of learner, right? So visual, learned by hearing, visual by seeing, like pictures, graphs, videos, auditory, rhymes, songs, chants by hearing, and kinesthetic by doing, right? We already talked about collaborative learning. We also want to use lots of small group targeted instruction. What I mean by that is you break them into groups by the skills that they need to work on. So some students might need help with still adding 1-digit numbers. Some are ready for 2 digits. Some might even be ready for multiplication, right? So they're all different what they can do. Use non-linguistic representations like charts, pictures, graphs. Make it fun with songs, rhymes, and chants. Use manipulatives hands-on. If you need more knowledge about classroom management, there's a book called Classroom Instruction That Works that has research-based methods you can use. We also want to teach students metacognitive strategies. That's thinking about their own thinking, self-evaluation. So as you're reading a word problem out loud, you pause and say, I didn't understand this. I'm going to go back and reread that or look for keywords, right? We need to help students make goals. They should be their goals, but with some guidance from us and some feedback. Homework should always be meaningful, never busy work. And the same thing with classwork. It should have a purpose. It should be tied to the TEKS and should have a purpose. All right, so some of you guys got here after I started. Luckily, you didn't miss much. We just started on competency 1. But before I go any further, I want to show you something really quickly that I think you'll find interesting. If you just Google EPP passing rates 2023, you can see the state's latest data on the passing rates for the core subjects EC through 6, for all the tests, in fact. But let's look at math. You can see that the passing rate is 77%. So it's not too bad, but it could be better, right? So 77% of first-time takers pass the test. So it's one of the lower passing rates among core subjects, but it's higher than some of the other tests that are out there. So if you have taken it and haven't been successful, you're not alone, right? 23% of people don't pass it the first time. And a lot of times that's because they didn't have the right study material, right? So you've got to find something that's aligned to the competencies and something that appeals to your learning style. Because some of the programs out there are aligned to the competencies, but they're so thorough and overwhelming that you can't get through them. So I've tried to make mine very concise, but still thorough enough to have everything you need. All right, so now we talk about instructional strategies. This is stuff we already touched on in activities. Everything should be learner-centered, right? You also, of course, have to teach the TEKS. We know that, right? But you also have to address the ELPs if you have even one English language learner in your classroom, which almost everybody will. So in my course, I link the ELPs. If you don't have my course, you can Google ELPs and it will come up, English Language Proficiency Standards. We have to know Piaget's stages of cognitive development. And this is super important because it comes up on every subject area of the test. So stage 1 is sensory motor, birth to 2 years old. This is for babies and toddlers, right? They learn by putting everything in their mouth and by moving. So we won't have students in that stage unless maybe you teach life skills, right? Then we have the pre-operation stage. Usually they're 2 to 7 years old. They're very egocentric. That means they're basically self-centered. They can only think of things from their perspective, but they are slowly starting to decenter to be able to think of things from other people's point of view. They also show traits of animism, symbolism, and moral realism. So animism means they think everything has the traits of living beings. So if they break a toy, they might cry because they think they hurt it, because it seems like it's alive to them. Symbolism, they're starting to understand that something's a symbol of something else. And moral realism, they think everybody has the same moral code as them. So that's the pre-operation stage, right? So you want to memorize those things that I mentioned about pre-operations. Next, we have the concrete operation stage. Usually they're 7 to 11 years old, and they're starting to think in more rational terms, more operational, but they still need a concrete item to be able to think about something. So it's called the concrete operation stage. They also start to understand conservation. So I think of the con in conservation and the con in concrete, and that helps me remember it. So conservation means they can understand that just because two things look different doesn't mean that they're actually different. Like, for example, a tall, skinny glass of 8 ounces of water is the same amount of water as a short, wide cup of 8 ounces. But before that stage, if you ask them which one has more, they'll almost always pick the tall glass, thinking that has more, not understanding they could be the same. And then the last stage is formal operations. Usually they're 11 to 12 years or even 16 years old when they start this stage. And this is when they can think abstractly. They no longer need a physical item. They can engage in hypothetic deductive reasoning, so they can think about a theory and the factors that could affect the outcome. We want to use technology in the classroom, so things like StarFall, BrainPop. Nowadays, a lot of people are using Blooket, Quizlet, things like that to make it fun and interactive, right? Use fraction strips and fraction wheels, counters, all kinds of manipulatives. We talked a little bit about instructional grouping. So when you're doing fun activities, collaborative learning, it's great to do heterogeneous grouping where they're grouped different ability levels, different interests, different backgrounds, things like that. But when we're doing small group targeted instruction and working on skills, we do want to group them homogeneously by their ability level, their skill level at that point in time. And we want to constantly be assessing them and making changes, because some students will be moving up to a higher level, right? Some students will stay the same for a little while. Students might even sometimes regress a little bit if something is going on at home. All right. We want to use standard units of measure like feet, inches, meters, centimeters, but we also want to teach non-standard units of measure where they measure with pencils or paper clips. When they learn about angles, they should learn how to use protractors, right? You also should teach them how to estimate by filling up a container with balls or candy and asking them to guess how many candy pieces are in there, and play money to help them learn money. This is a repeat of what we already did. They repeat things in the manual, so I repeated in my course, but we already went over that. We didn't talk about Bloom's taxonomy and appropriate questions. This is the hierarchy of questions. So in my course, I go into more detail, but basically at the lower levels, it's asking, do you remember? Do you understand? And as it gets higher, it's apply, analyze, evaluate, and at the top is create, where they make their own new product or idea. Right? So we want to use all levels, but we really want to hit this critical thinking at the higher levels. Learning goals and instruction. So we know we have to follow the TEKS. It's very helpful to post the TEKS on the board and go over what our goals are for the day. Plan activities that meet the needs of all types of learners, like we talked about. Vary our types of assessments. So we want informal assessments that are not used for a grade, like a show what you know, an exit ticket, something like that. And also formal assessments like a quiz or a test. And if we use both, we'll have a better understanding of what they can actually do. We also want to use formative assessments, which are given while a student is still working on a concept, you're still teaching. So you're still forming your instruction and they're forming their knowledge. That's a formative assessment. A summative assessment is given at the end when everything is summed up. So the STAR test is given towards the end of the year. That's a summative assessment, but a release STAR test that is used as a benchmark, maybe in October, would be a formative assessment. We want to plan interdisciplinary units where we connect different subjects. So we connect math to science, social studies, language arts, and that's very effective. Also, we want to use thematic units where we have a theme. So for example, maybe your theme is apples and you do a unit on Johnny Appleseed. And it's interdisciplinary because you connect math, science, social studies, language arts. Maybe for social studies, they read about Johnny Appleseed. Language arts, they write a response. Art, they draw a picture. Math, they learn how to follow a recipe to double a recipe and make applesauce, something like that. So the theme is apples and it's interdisciplinary because it connects different subjects. Remember, we talked about metacognition, thinking about thinking. We want to always be modeling our thinking and showing them how to evaluate their own thinking. We already talked about the different types of assessments. They just mentioned that again. And we already talked about the ELPS too, that we want to address these English language proficiency standards. So I definitely recommend you go through the ELPS and be familiar with that because you have to do that by law. So you want to get, even if it doesn't come up on your test, you have to know it. Assessments are usually for grades and sometimes used to compare a student's performance to his peers. And they usually feel pressure, right, with formal assessments, but informal assessments might not be for a grade. So we want to use both because they can give us the whole picture. Norm reference tests compare a student to his peers, kind of like the SAT, where you're in a certain percentile. Criterion reference tests test the student's knowledge of certain skills and criteria, like the STAR test. And then we want to teach students how to use math and how we use math in the workplace by inviting guest speakers and things like that. So, and show them how math is used in the real world. So let's look at some sample questions. I'm going to skip that one because I don't think you can see that one. All right. And then if you want to put your answer in the chat box. The non-standard units of measure. That's right. Good job. Let's do one more. So this one, I'll put C and I'll show you what happens. This one is B, a formative assessment, because your formative assessment is given while you're still teaching a unit. And it says that she's reviewing what they understand so far, what they're still studying, right? So she's still teaching the unit. It doesn't say she finished it. Then it would be summative. So do you guys have any questions about the core subjects exam?
No.
No? All right. Well, I appreciate it. In case you need a good study guide, maybe the one you have isn't working for you. If you want to try out my courses, you got a little preview. Now, of course, my course has way more than that because we just looked at one competency. Um, but in case you want to enroll in my courses, I'll put the link in the chat. And then I post videos on Facebook that you probably see. So you can keep checking those out. And I have a YouTube channel, Texas Teacher Today. But if y'all don't have any questions, I'll let y'all go. But I can stick around a minute or two if there's any questions.
I think I'm good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks to both of y'all. Have a great night.
You too.